She had nothing left. No money, no help, no way out. Just a ranch she was about to lose, a town full of people watching her fail, and a debt she never knew existed until the man who created it smiled and handed her the papers. Then a stranger walked out of a storm. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make promises. He just picked up the other end of what she was holding and didn't let go. But here is what no one in that town understood. The most dangerous thing about Clara Voss was not her stubbornness. It was the knowledge her father had given her before she was 12 years old. Knowledge that one powerful man would do anything to take. And she had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for exactly the right moment to use it. This is a story about what happens when the person everyone underestimated finally decides it is time. This story carries a simple truth worth holding on to. The people who survive the hardest seasons are not always the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes they are simply the ones who refused to let go of what they knew was right. Welcome to this channel, where we bring you stories of the American West, frontier love, the unbreakable bond between mothers and children. If this story moves something in you, hit that like button and leave a comment. Now settle in. This one is worth every minute.
The paper smelled like ink and trouble, and Clara Voss had learned to recognize both. She stood outside the barn at 5 in the morning with the red Bluff bank notice in her bare hands, reading it for the third time. Not because she didn't understand it. The first time she read it, her hands shook. The second time, her eyes went blurry. The third time, she needed to be certain she wasn't still asleep on the narrow bed she hadn't shared with anyone for 8 months. $3,200, due in 90 days. The Wyoming fog sat heavy on the grassland, the kind that didn't apologize for blocking your view. She could see maybe 10 steps in any direction. The barn, the fence line, the dark shape of the cattle pen. Everything beyond that was gray and swallowed up. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. Clara Voss was 24 years old. She had been a widow for 8 months, a rancher for 3, and a woman alone for longer than either of those things. The Voss Ranch was 400 acres of Wyoming grassland, 80 head of cattle, and a house that still smelled faintly of whiskey in the corners no matter how many times she scrubbed the floors. It was also the only thing she had left of the life she had tried to build before she understood the full nature of the man she had married. Her father, Reverend Morrison, had stood at the altar and called Thomas Voss a good man. Her father had believed that because Thomas was good at being believed, and because her father had been the kind of man who trusted the face people showed him in church. Her father had been gone 2 years. Thomas had been gone 8 months. And Hector Voss, Thomas's father, the owner of the Red Bluff Savings and Loan, had waited exactly 6 days after the funeral before setting a stack of loan documents on her kitchen table with a smile she had been replaying in her mind ever since. She had $340 in her strongbox. She had cattle that needed 3 more months before sale season. She had 2 ranch hands who had quit the previous week after Hector, in his pleasant and reasonable way, had suggested to them that working for a widow with no future was a waste of a capable man's time. She could not leave. Her father's name and memory lived in this town, in the church on the corner of Main and 2nd, in the faces of the families he had buried and married and counseled for 20 years. If she walked away from the ranch, she walked away from all of that. And she could not stay, because the math did not work, and the clock was running, and she was standing in the fog at 5 in the morning trying to find a way through a problem that did not have a visible solution from where she stood. That was October 4th, 1883. The storm came in that afternoon 3 hours earlier than the sky had any right to produce it. She was trying to repair the east fence line alone, which was a 2-person job, when the wind picked up and the rain started and the light went flat and gray all at once. Not a gentle rain, a Wyoming storm, the kind that reminded you where you were and what that meant. Wind strong enough to take a fence board out of your hands if you weren't holding with everything you had. Rain thick enough to make the fence post 20 feet away look like suggestions. She was holding the board with both hands, a hammer tucked under her arm, trying to figure out the mechanics of driving a nail without a third hand, when she heard it. Hoof beats in the rain. Coming across her east pasture, off the trail, cutting across open land on a route that only someone who knew this property would take. Or someone who wasn't paying attention to where they were going because they were paying attention to what was behind them. She heard the second set of hoofbeats a moment later, maybe half a mile back. Fatauma. Coming at a canter, then stopping. Whoever it was had pulled up at the property line and decided against following. The first horse came out of the rain with a man leading it by the reins. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat darkened with water. He didn't look at her with surprise. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has the skill to address. He tied his horse to the nearest post, walked to the fence, put both hands on the board she was holding and held it steady without being asked. She drove the nails. They repaired the entire section in the rain without saying a single word. When the last nail was in, and she stepped back, she looked at him. He looked at her. The rain was still coming down, and neither of them had anywhere obvious to be. "Barn," she said, not an invitation. His horse needed shelter, and practicality was the language she had been speaking for 8 months, because it was the only one that didn't cost anything. He nodded. That was all. As they walked toward the barn, she glanced once over her shoulder into the rain. Nothing behind them. Whatever had been following him had stopped at her fence line. She filed that away and said nothing. He reached past her to push the barn door open against the wind, and his coat swung open for a moment. She saw it then, tucked in the inner breast pocket, not worn, not displayed. A Pinkerton badge broken clean in half, the two pieces sitting together in the pocket the way a man keeps something he can't throw away and can't use. His coat fell closed. She hadn't been meant to see it. She looked at the door instead. Inside the barn, she latched the door against the wind and listened to the rain hammering on the roof overhead. It was the first time in 8 months that someone had stood on the same side of something as her. Even if that something was only a fence board in a storm, that should not have felt like anything at all. The fact that it did was the thing she decided not to examine too closely. The rain stopped before dawn, and he was still there. Clara came out at first light and found him walking the west fence line, checking for damage from the storm, not because anyone had asked him to, but because it was the obvious next thing to do, and he was apparently a man who did the obvious next thing without needing to be directed. She stood on the porch and watched him for a moment. He moved like someone who had been doing physical work his whole life. No wasted motion, no performance. His name was Jesse Kane. She learned that when she called out to him and he turned and walked back toward the house. He told her his name the way he'd held the fence board without ceremony. She told him hers. Then she told him what she had. "I need a ranch hand for 3 months. No cash up front. Pay is room, board, and 10% of cattle sale profit in January. If I still have a ranch to sell from by then." He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to decline. She had already started calculating what she would do next when he said, "What is the 10% based on?" She went inside and got the ledger. He read it without hurrying, turned every page, asked nothing, closed it, looked out at the pasture where the fog was finally starting to lift. "All right," he said. 3 months. She didn't ask him where he'd come from or where he'd been going or what the broken Pinkerton badge in his coat pocket meant. She didn't ask about the second horse in the rain. She asked if he had tools of his own, and he said yes. And she showed him the equipment barn. And that was how Jesse Kane came to work at the Voss Ranch. What she didn't know was what he had seen in the ledger that made him agree. It wasn't the 10%. It was 1 page near the back, written in a different ink, in handwriting that was smaller and more controlled than the accounting columns. March 14th. Thomas fell. March 15th, notified Hector. March 16th, Hector brought papers. No word of grief anywhere on the page. Only dates and facts, recorded by someone who had decided that facts were safer than feelings. Jesse Kane had spent 6 years as a Pinkerton detective reading the things people didn't say in the documents they wrote. He knew when a story had a chapter that hadn't been told yet. May Dunbar came by that evening. May was 50 years old, ran the boarding house on 2nd Street, and had been Clara's mother's closest friend for 30 years before Clara's mother passed. She arrived with a jar of preserved peaches and the particular energy of a woman who has formed an opinion and is deciding whether it is her place to share it. She looked at Jessie with the careful assessment of someone who has lived long enough to not be surprised by much, but remains capable of concern. After Jessie went outside to see to his horse, May said, "Hector won't be pleased when he hears you've taken on a stranger." "Hector doesn't sign my payroll," Clara said. "No, but he's the one holding that paper." May set the peaches on the table. "And you still haven't told me why Thomas really fell that afternoon, Clara." Clara didn't answer. May left without pushing further. That was the thing about May. She knew when to set something down and come back to it. After she was gone, Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked at her work gloves sitting on the surface, still damp from yesterday's rain. Brown leather, worn thin at the fingertips, the palms darkened by years of fence posts and saddle leather and the particular dirt of Wyoming grassland. She had worn them every day since Thomas died. She wore them the way some women wore their grief, visibly and without explanation. Except it wasn't grief she was wearing them to cover. The 3-month arrangement looked like a temporary solution. She knew it was likely only a delay. But she looked at those gloves on the table and felt something she didn't have a name for. A sense that the 3 months ahead were going to change something that couldn't be changed back. She didn't know if that was a warning or a promise. She wasn't sure there was a difference. Wyoming in October was not gently cold. It was the kind of cold that cut through whatever you were wearing if you hadn't dressed with intention, and it arrived earlier in the morning than you expected and stayed later in the evening than you wanted. Jessie dressed correctly for it. Clara noticed that on the 3rd day. She noticed other things, too, in the way you notice things when you are working alongside someone from before sunrise to after sunset. And silence is the primary language between you. She noticed that he was up before her every morning. She noticed that he checked the water troughs before she asked. She noticed that when she changed direction without announcing it, he adjusted without being told, as if he was watching her peripheral vision rather than waiting for instruction. On the 3rd day, they were pushing the herd over the north slope when his horse slid on a patch of mud from the previous night's cold. He kept the horse and didn't go down, but the led bull saw the moment of distraction and broke toward the eastern draw. Clara had already cut from the opposite side before Jessie had finished correcting his horse. She brought the bull back. He watched her do it and said nothing. But from that morning forward, he never positioned himself in a way that required her to compensate for him. He began studying the way she worked and adjusting to it without being asked. It was the most careful form of attention she had ever been paid, and it was paid entirely in action, without a single word. On the 7th day, they patched the equipment shed roof. Clara went up first. Jessie stayed below, passing materials up to her, not because he couldn't climb, but because she climbed faster, and they both understood this without discussing it. Danny was there that morning. Danny was 16 and had been doing odd jobs around the ranch for the previous owner, and then for Thomas, and now for Clara, without anyone examining too closely the question of where he slept or who was responsible for him. He had no family that anyone in Red Bluff could name with certainty. He was thin and observant, and he worked harder than most men twice his age. He stood below the roof watching Jessie hand boards up and asked, "How come you don't go up yourself?" Jessie looked at him. "She is better at it than I am." Danny looked up at Clara on the roof, then back at Jessie, with the expression of a boy who has learned to sort people quickly because sorting them wrong has consequences. He put Jessie in a category and seemed satisfied with the placement. On the 10th day, Clara came down with a fever. It wasn't dramatic. It was the working kind, the kind you push through until you realize you have already pushed past the point where pushing does anything useful. She made it to mid-morning and then sat down on a hay bale inside the barn and did not get back up. Jessie found her there. He did not make a fuss. He brought water from the well, set it beside her, and went back outside to take over the afternoon feeding without asking her permission. He understood that asking would require her to refuse, What Clara could not manage was the feeling that came to her sitting still in the barn while she listened to him working outside. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and more difficult to categorize. The specific discomfort of a woman who had learned, across 3 years of marriage to a man who used every vulnerability she showed against her, that needing anything from anyone was a door you left unlocked at your own risk. She sat with the sound of his work moving around the perimeter of the barn and felt relief instead of danger, and she did not know what to do with that. So she sat on the hay bale until the fever broke in the evening, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did he. On the 15th day, they had supper together at the kitchen table with Danny, and it was the first time the three of them had sat down to a meal at the same time. Clara cooked. Jessie ate without complimenting the food, but finished everything in the pot. That was the language of someone raised without enough. You proved the meal was good by leaving nothing behind. Clara recognized it because her father had grown up hungry and had the same habit. Danny ate fast, thanked her, and went home. Clara started clearing the table. Jessie stood and began washing the dishes without being asked. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. "I know," he answered. They washed the dishes together in silence, and for the first time the quiet between them didn't need filling because it wasn't empty. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table after Jessie had gone to the barn and thought about the fact that Thomas had lived in this house for 3 years and she had never once heard him wash a dish without being asked twice. She opened the ledger to write the day's figures. The numbers blurred after a few minutes. She sat with the pen in her hand and the book open and wrote nothing at all. 1 week later, the first light snow of the season came down overnight and left the pasture looking like a page no one had written on yet. Jessie was waiting at the west gate when Clara came out in the early gray light. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking northwest with the expression of someone who has noticed a thing and is waiting for the right moment to ask about it. She understood. She had been waiting for the right moment herself. She led him to the northwest corner. The land there looked like the rest of the ranch to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The grass ran a shade deeper green in one long patch. The soil shifted color across a band about 30 feet wide. Nothing that would make a stranger stop. Clara knelt and took a handful of soil and held it out to Jessie. "Smell it." He took it. Mineral. Calcium and magnesium. Soil above a significant underground water source carries that. My father learned it from the Arapaho people when he was young, and he taught it to me before I was 12 years old. She stood. Enough water to supply the whole district in a drought year. Hector Voss does not know it is here. Jessie was quiet for a moment. "Why haven't you used it?" "Because once I use it, everyone knows it is there. And I only get to use it once." She looked at him. "I am waiting until I have no other choice." He looked at her face rather than at the ground. "You are waiting for the right moment." "I am waiting until there is no other choice," she said again. "Those are different things." He understood the difference. She could see that he did. On the walk back through the pasture, he mentioned that the cattle had been avoiding the southeast water trough. Clara looked at the ground around the trough for 30 seconds, walked 30 feet east, and said, "Dig here. 4 feet down, maybe a little less." He looked skeptical, but he dug. At 3.5 feet, water seeped in. The trough had been pulling from a contaminated pocket. The clean source was right here where no one had thought to look. Jessie looked at the water, then at her. He didn't say anything. But that was the moment he stopped thinking of her land knowledge as a story she told about herself and understood it as a real and operational thing she carried in her body the way other people carried arithmetic or carpentry. That afternoon, Hector Voss arrived at the ranch without notice. He was dressed carefully, as always. His horse was well groomed. His boots were clean in the way of a man who does not walk through mud if he can arrange for someone else to walk through it for him. He had the face of someone who has been trusted for so long that the appearance of trustworthiness has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. He looked at Jessie with the eyes of a man, cataloging a new variable in a calculation he thought he had completed. "I was not aware you had taken on help," Hector said. "He is a hired hand." "Not your concern," Clara said. "Everything touching my collateral is my concern, Clara." He smiled. "You know I only want what is best for all parties." Jesse was 10 yards away checking rope, not looking toward them. But Hector glanced at him once more before he left, and the glance was not dismissal. It was calculation. After Hector's horse disappeared down the lane, Jesse said, "He will find a way around your current arrangement." "I know. How much time?" 70 days. They looked at each other across the distance of a few feet and the much greater distance of everything they hadn't yet said. 70 days was enough time for the cattle to reach sale weight. It was not enough time for anything else, and they both understood that. That evening, Clara opened the ledger and looked at the numbers. For the first time since March, she did not see failure when she looked at them. She saw an equation, and equations had solutions, if you were willing to commit the right variable at the right moment. She closed the ledger, set her work gloves on top of it, and thought about the fact that simply having someone stand beside you and look at the same problem made the problem look different. She didn't know what to call that. She decided it didn't need a name yet. Red Bluff held its monthly community meeting at the church on the second Tuesday of every month. Clara's father had organized these meetings for 20 years, and they had continued after him, maintained by the weight of habit and the particular inertia of small towns that have been doing things a certain way for long enough that no one can remember why they started. Clara went because her father had always gone. Jesse came because she asked him to, without explaining why, and he came without asking for an explanation. Hector Voss was presenting a proposal. He called it a Regional Water Resource Development Initiative for the Northwest District of Johnson County. He had a survey map professionally rendered showing the district overlaid with elevation lines and geological notation. He spoke about collective benefit and long-term investment, and the opportunity for the entire region to increase its productivity through the responsible development of shared natural resources. Clara went still when she heard the words Northwest District. The area on his map included the northwest corner of the Voss Ranch. Hector did not name the Voss Ranch. He spoke in the language of generality, the language of civic improvement, the language of a man who has learned that people are more comfortable supporting a thing when they believe they are supporting an idea rather than a specific outcome. 3 other ranch owners were nodding. Jesse sat beside her. He said quietly, "He knows." "He suspects," she said, keeping her eyes on the map. "Those are not the same thing. What will you do?" "Listen." After the meeting, Hector found her near the door and gave her the warm, concerned smile he had been giving her since the week after Thomas's funeral. "Clara, I hope you won't let personal feeling cloud sound judgment. This is an opportunity for the whole region. Your father would have understood the importance of community cooperation." The use of her father's name was deliberate. It always was. "I will give it thought, Hector," she said. He looked at Jesse, standing 2 steps behind her. The smile didn't change. But he didn't offer it to Jesse. What Clara didn't see, because she was watching Hector's face, was what Jesse saw from across the room. On his way out, Hector stopped briefly near the side door to speak with a man Clara didn't recognize. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, the kind of conversation where both parties already know what they are going to say before they begin. The stranger left immediately after. Jesse had spent 6 years briefing operatives and being briefed by handlers. He knew what that exchange looked like. He didn't have enough yet to bring to Clara, so he filed it and said nothing. 2 days after the meeting, one of the neighboring ranch hands brought Clara word that the stranger from the church had been asking questions around town. About Thomas Voss, about the circumstances of his death, about whether Thomas had made any arrangements regarding property before he died. This was not yet a legal action. This was Hector building a case before filing one. The day after that, Clara went to town for supplies, and Jesse stayed at the ranch. Danny was working on the water trough repair near the southeast pasture. Hector rode past the ranch road, stopped briefly, and spoke to Danny for less than 2 minutes before riding on. Danny didn't come back to work the next morning. He sent word that he was needed elsewhere. Jesse saw Hector from the barn doorway. He understood, without needing the specific words, what a man like Hector says to a boy with no one to protect him. That the woman you are working for is going to lose everything, and anyone connected to her when it happens will lose too. Jesse went to find Danny. He found him in town, sitting outside the hardware store with the particular stillness of a boy who has made a decision he isn't sure about. Jesse sat beside him. He didn't argue. He said, "The outcome isn't certain yet." Danny came back. Jesse said nothing to Clara about where Danny had gone or why, just, "He is back." Clara accepted this without asking for the details. But she noticed Jesse's face when he said it, and she noticed that Danny didn't look in the direction of the road to town for the rest of the week. May pulled Clara aside after the community meeting that same evening. "Hector spoke to 3 of your other creditors before that meeting started. Did you know that?" Clara didn't know. "He is building a case that you lack the competence to manage the collateral." May looked directly at her. "You need to tell me about Thomas. The whole truth, not for judgment, because I might be able to help if I know enough." "Not now," Clara said. "When is now, then?" Clara didn't answer. May looked across the churchyard to where Jesse was standing near the fence. Then she looked back at Clara with the particular expression of a woman who has seen enough marriages to know the difference between the way a man looks at a woman he respects and the way a man looks at a woman he is trying to manage. "That man looks at you the way Thomas never did," May said. "You know that, don't you?" Clara walked away without answering. That same week, Hector sent a property assessor to the ranch. His name was Aldrich. He was older, experienced, and he carried geological survey equipment. He was sent to find the water source. Clara walked him over every section of the ranch. She took him through the northwest corner in the early afternoon, specifically timing it for the hour when the sun angle flattened color contrast in the soil, and the variation she could read from 20 feet was invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. She chose a route that kept his attention oriented south and east. She pointed out unremarkable things with the confidence of a thorough tour guide. Aldrich didn't stop in the northwest corner because nothing about it caught his eye. He completed his survey and found nothing of particular additional value. After he rode out, Jesse asked, "How did he miss it?" Clara allowed something close to a smile, brief and controlled. "Because I walked him through at the time of day when the sun kills color differentiation in the soil. And I kept him looking south." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "Your father taught you that. He thought I would need it someday." She looked northwest. He was right. That evening, a rider brought word that Hector had filed a petition with the county court, requesting a formal review of Clara's competency to manage secured lending collateral. The specific grounds were her decision to hire an unverified stranger. The target was Jesse. Remove Jesse, and she worked alone, which meant she fell behind, which meant the cattle weren't ready by the deadline, which meant the debt came due on Hector's terms rather than hers. That night, Clara lay awake and tried to build a version of Thomas Voss in her mind that would never have signed over the ranch to his father. She had known him for 4 years. She had married him and lived beside him and learned the exact weight of his silences. But Thomas had surprised her before, not with cruelty, with something almost sadder. The quiet surrender of a man who had given up on himself and found it easier to drag the people around him down than to climb back up alone. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall and did not sleep. The night the legal petition arrived, Clara could not sleep. She went out to the front porch at some hour past midnight and sat in the cold with her coat pulled close. The Wyoming sky at that hour and that altitude was the kind of sky that reminded you of the actual scale of things. Stars from one edge of the world to the other, with nothing between you and them but cold, clear air and the sound of wind through dry grass. Jesse came out a few minutes later. He didn't ask why she was there. He sat on the porch step, one step below her, and looked out at the dark pasture. They sat like that for long enough that the cold settled into its nighttime depth and the stars moved a fraction of the distance they move in an hour. "What did you do before this?" she asked, the first time she had asked. He looked at the dark pasture for longer than the question required. When he answered, it was the first time he had strung more than 2 sentences together since the morning he arrived. "Pinkerton, 6 years. Why did you leave?" "Because once I followed orders instead of what I knew was right. And someone innocent died because of it." She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say it wasn't his fault. She asked, who was she? Not a question about the case, a question about the person. Jessie heard the difference. This was the way she showed respect for a difficult thing, not by making it smaller, but by asking for its actual shape. He told her. Her name was Rose Alderman. She was 30 years old, a seamstress in a town in Colorado. And she was accused of complicity in a bank robbery because the bank owner needed someone to blame, and the real perpetrators had connections that made them inconvenient to pursue. Jesse knew the evidence was fabricated. His supervisor at the Pinkertons told him it didn't matter. He made the arrest. Rose died in the county jail 90 days later of pneumonia that went untreated because the county jail in that district did not provide medical care for women prisoners. He had carried that for 6 years. He had never told anyone. "The scar on your hand," Clara said, looking at his right hand resting on his knee. "The arrest. She ran. I caught her by the wrist and she fell, and the gun came loose." He looked at his right hand in the dark. "I figured this was something that ought to stay." Clara looked at his hand. She didn't touch it. Not yet. But she looked at it the way she looked at things she intended to understand. "Hector is the same construction," she said after a moment. "He does not need to be cruel to do cruel things. He just needs everything to be legal." "Did Thomas know about the water source?" "No. My father only told me." A pause. "Thomas drank. When he drank, he wasn't the man I married. I didn't tell him about the water because I was afraid he would mention it to Hector without meaning any harm by it." Jessie said, "You were afraid of your husband." Not a question. She didn't deny it. "I didn't cry at the funeral," she said. "The whole town saw. No one asked why. They just decided what it meant." She had not said that to anyone. She heard herself say it and understood that she had been holding it for 8 months like a stone in a closed fist. The wind picked up. Colder now, the kind of cold that meant the temperature was still dropping. Clara stood. Jessie stood. At the door, she stopped. She turned back and looked at him in the dark with the kind of attention that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't soften anything but simply states the truth as clearly as she knew how to state it. "Don't walk away." Not a plea, not a command. The truth said out loud for the first time. He nodded. He went inside. Clara stood in the dark hallway with her hand still on the door latch, and understood that those 3 words were words she had never once said to Thomas. Not when he came home late. Not when he came home wrong. Not when she lay awake at 2 in the morning counting the sounds of a house that had stopped feeling like a home. She had never asked Thomas to stay because somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage she had stopped caring whether he did. She pressed her back against the door in the dark and understood that what she had just said to a man who had been on her property for 3 weeks was evidence of something she was not yet ready to name. Week 6. Wyoming winter arrived in earnest that week. Not the preliminary dusting of early October, but a true blizzard. 2 days of whiteout conditions, the kind of storm where you didn't go outside because outside had become actively hostile to human survival. The sky and the ground were the same color. The fence posts at 20 feet were theoretical. Danny had gone home the afternoon before the storm came in, which was good. Clara and Jessie were alone in the house with enough firewood and enough food, and the particular compressed quality of time that comes when the world outside shuts itself down, and the world inside becomes the whole of what exists. The second night of the blizzard, Clara was reading letters from her father. She kept them in a small wooden box under her bed, letters he had written in the last year of his life, and left for her to find afterward. She had read them many times. She read them again when she needed to hear his voice, and the voice was no longer available to her in any other form. Jessie was at the fireplace mending a bridle, working slowly and carefully in the firelight. "Did your father leave you anything?" she asked without looking up from the page. Jessie stopped working. "No. I didn't know my father." "Your mother?" "Left when I was 6. She put the letter down and looked at him for the first time that evening. "How did you grow up?" "Whatever way worked. Early." "Do you remember the first morning you woke up and knew there wasn't anyone looking after you anymore?" He stopped moving the leather through his hands. "Yes. I had that morning. Not when my father died. The first time Thomas came home and looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person. The fire cracked. The blizzard moved along the north wall of the house. "Do you want to hear more about Rose?" he asked. Unexpected. He was opening the subject without being prompted, the first time he had done this. "If you want to tell it." And he did. Because in the warmth of this room, in the storm, with this woman who held her father's letters the way most people hold only a very few things in their lives, he felt for the first time in years that there was somewhere to put down what he had been carrying. Near midnight, Clara fell asleep in the chair with the letter still in her hand. Jessie watched her sleep for a moment. Then he took the letter carefully from between her fingers and folded it, and put it back in the wooden box. He got the blanket from the chest by the window and laid it over her without waking her. He went back to the fireplace and sat there for a long time in the firelight. He thought for the first time about what it would mean to still be here in the spring. 2 days after the blizzard in town for supplies, a man at the hardware store asked Jessie loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "You are the drifter working the Voss widow's place? What is your story? Where did you come from before here?" Jessie went completely still. His hands stopped moving. The room heard the quality of that stillness. He answered without expression. "I came from south. I am going north. Right now I am here." He paid and walked out. Clara had been at his dry goods counter across the street. She stepped outside at the wrong moment and saw his face as he came through the door. Not anger. The opposite. The face of a man who has locked something down with such total control that the control itself becomes visible, like a door bolted so tightly the bolt shows through the wood. That evening, alone in the kitchen, the man at the hardware store. "It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. I saw your face." He was quiet. "When someone asks me what my story is, there is a version I can tell and a version I cannot. The version I can tell is true, but it is not complete." "I know that feeling," she said. "I know you do." May came by the day after the blizzard, bringing apple bread because that was a practical thing to bring after 2 days of being shut in, and looked at Clara and Jessie with the specific attention of someone who has been watching a situation develop for weeks and has arrived at a conclusion. After Jessie went outside, May said, "Hector has been in contact with the magistrate's office in Cheyenne. He is not going through only the county court anymore." Clara absorbed this. "He is escalating. Men like Hector only escalate when they are scared." May set the bread on the table. "If you have something he doesn't know about, Clara, now is when it matters." Clara was quiet. "The water," May said, not a question. Clara looked at her. "You knew?" "Your father showed me once, years before he died." May met her eyes steadily. "He said whoever owned that corner of land should never have to beg anyone for anything. He said it was enough to make a life from." A pause. "I believe he was right." Then came the week that broke everything. Jessie rode to town for supplies on a Thursday morning. Clara was alone at the ranch. Hector Voss arrived at 11 o'clock. He was particularly pleasant that day. He brought the document in a leather folio, which was a detail that stayed with Clara for a long time afterward. The deliberateness of the presentation, the care with which he laid it on her kitchen table. It was a deed of transfer. Thomas Voss, dated 11 months before his death. In the event of Thomas's death without surviving heirs, the Voss Ranch and all associated land title transferred to Hector Voss. Thomas's signature, notarized, filed. Clara looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Thomas signed this under duress, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hand on the document was not. That is what you would need to demonstrate to the county court, Hector said pleasantly. You have 30 days to file a contest before I exercise the transfer. I sincerely hope you find a way through this. I have always had your best interests at heart. He left. The door closed behind him with the quiet sound of a man who has all the time in the world. Jesse came back 2 hours later. He read the document, read the signature, read the notarization, and said the wrong thing. Not because he was cruel, but because 6 years of Pinkerton work had trained his first response to a document to be an evaluation of its evidentiary integrity, rather than an understanding of what the person holding it needed from him in that moment. Clara, is it possible Thomas signed this voluntarily? She looked at him. What? I am not saying he was right. I am saying we need to know the full truth before we proceed. You are asking me whether my husband deliberately left me with nothing. I am trying to help you look at this clearly. You do not know what was clear or unclear in my marriage. She was right. He knew she was right the moment the words left his mouth. He had made the detective's error in the wrong room, treated evidence before treating the person holding it. Get out, she said. Even, absolute. The way she said everything that mattered. He went. Day 1. Clara rode to see the county attorney, a man named Whitfield, who had offices above the telegraph station. He read the document carefully. The signature is clean. The notarization is properly filed. Without direct evidence of coercion, this will stand as written. On the ride home, she passed the church. She pulled her horse up outside it. Someone was inside practicing the organ. She could hear it through the walls. Her father had stood in that building every Sunday for 20 years. She had sat in the front row and believed the things he said, because he said them with his whole body. She did not go in. She sat on her horse in the cold and listened to the organ until the playing stopped. Then she rode home. Day 2. Danny came to the ranch in the morning. Not because he was scheduled, because he had heard something in town and was worried. He sat on the front porch step, the same step where Jessie had sat 11 days earlier, and looked up at her. You okay, Miss Clara? 16 years old. No family. No one whose job it was to check on him. Asking after her. She sat down on the step beside him. Not entirely, she said, which was more than she would have said to almost anyone else. Danny nodded slowly. Jesse left his gear in the barn, he said after a while. He did not go far. She didn't respond, but she noted it. Day 3, May came. Clara told her everything about Thomas. Not the version that ended with he drank too much, the complete version, the specific quality of the fear she had lived with in the 2nd and 3rd years of her marriage. The night she lay awake doing arithmetic about what her options were and came up with a very short list. May listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. When Clara was done, May asked, Is it possible Thomas signed that document not out of hatred, but out of the cowardice of a man who had given up on himself and could not face the consequences of the life he had made? Clara thought about it for a long time. Yes, she said. That is more likely than the other version. Does that change what you have the right to do? No. Then that is your answer. After May left, Clara sat with the ledger on the table in front of her. She didn't open it. She put her work gloves on top of it, then took them off and set them beside it. And she understood 2 things at the same moment. Thomas had probably signed that document voluntarily, out of the accumulated surrender of a man who had stopped fighting. And that did not make Jessie wrong for asking. It made her angry, because he had asked the question she was most afraid to ask herself. Those were different things. She had been treating them as the same thing. She went to find Jesse. He was in the barn, sitting on the hay bale where she had found him working leather on his second day at the ranch. He looked up when she came in. The late afternoon light came through the gaps in the siding in long, slanted lines. "I know Thomas probably signed it himself," she said. "I knew it before you asked. I was angry because you asked what I was most afraid to ask myself. That was not fair to you. I'm sorry." Jesse was quiet for a moment, then, "What do you need?" "I need to go to court, and I need someone standing behind me when I do." He stood up. "When?" She went to the barn that evening and told Jesse exactly what she was going to do. She was going to disclose the water source to the county court, not as a negotiation with Hector, as formal evidence of independently created asset value predating Thomas's deed of transfer. Once she filed, Hector would know within hours. Her one card, the thing she had protected for years, would be on the table with no guarantee of how it would be ruled. "The legal argument," she said, "is that a resource identified, assessed, and documented by me as Clara Morrison, before my marriage, using knowledge inherited from my father, cannot be transferred by a marital deed I was not party to. The water source is Morrison knowledge applied to Voss land. Whitfield says that distinction may be enough." "Maybe," Jesse said. "Yes, maybe." She looked at him steadily. "I am filing tomorrow morning. I would like you there." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then, "What time?" 8 o'clock. I will be there at 7:30. Clara presented the water source to the magistrate the following morning. She had 3 years of soil samples, systematically collected and labeled in her father's glass jars. She had a hand-drawn geological survey, begun by her father and completed by her, showing the mineral concentration patterns across the northwest quadrant of the ranch. She had documentation of her identification and assessment of the resource, all of it dated before her marriage to Thomas Voss. Whitfield presented the legal argument. The resource was Morrison property. It predated the Voss marriage and could not be transferred by a marital deed created without Clara's knowledge or consent. Hector's attorney was a man from Cheyenne who had driven through the night. He argued well. He was experienced and confident, and he knew the specific language that made things sound settled when they weren't. The magistrate listened, took careful notes, asked 3 questions. Clara answered each one without hesitation. She had spent 3 years living with this knowledge, and she knew every detail of it the way she knew the land itself. At one point during the arguments, she looked once at Jesse, sitting in the back row. He wasn't nodding or making any signal. He was just looking at her with the particular attention she had come to recognize over 8 weeks. It said, "I believe in what you know." She turned back to the magistrate and finished her testimony. As the court emptied, Hector stopped beside Jesse near the door. His voice was quiet and pleasant. "She's going to lose this. And when she does, there will be nothing here for a man like you." There never was. Jesse looked at him. "I know." Hector left. Jesse stayed where he was until Clara came out of the chamber with Whitfield. He was still there when she came through the door, and she saw him before she saw anything else. The magistrate required 2 weeks to issue a ruling. They walked out of the courthouse into the November light. The sharp, high-altitude light that Wyoming has in that month, the kind that makes everything look simultaneously brittle and precise. Jesse walked beside her, not behind, not ahead. She had asked him to stand behind her in that room, and he had. Now they were outside, and the distance between them was different than it had been going in. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled on her work gloves. The leather was cold, her hands didn't shake. That seemed worth noting. She noted it and kept walking. 2 days before the ruling was due. The first real snowfall of winter came down overnight, steady and quiet, the kind that covered everything without asking permission, and left the world looking simplified, all its complications hidden under a clean white surface. Clara and Jessie were in the kitchen. Danny had gone home at dusk. May had left an hour earlier. The stove was going. Snow was building on the windowsills. Jessie spoke first. At the ranch, when I asked whether Thomas had signed willingly, I asked it like a detective reviewing testimony, looking for inconsistency in the account. That is not the right way to stand beside someone who just had something taken from them. I knew the difference. I chose wrong. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The thing that actually hurt was not the question itself. It was that in the moment you asked it, I realized I cared what you thought of me. And I was afraid of that. More afraid of that than I have been of Hector." She looked at the table. "I was married for 3 years, and I never once cared what Thomas thought of me. Not in the 2nd year. Not in the 3rd. I lived with that like it was normal. You made me understand it was not normal." Jessie said, "Next time I will ask the way a person asks. Because I want to understand, not because I'm looking for the flaw in the story. And I will not send someone away because they touch the thing I'm most afraid of," she said. "That is not fair to anyone who is trying to stay." The snow outside was quiet. The stove made its small sounds. "Will you stay after 3 months?" she asked. Straight, no preamble. Jessie was quiet for long enough that the snow outside seemed to get louder. "If the court rules against you, what will you do?" "Find different land. Start from the beginning." "With what?" "With the right to sell water access knowledge. Whoever ends up with that northwest corner still needs someone who can find the next source. That is knowledge Hector cannot take away." He looked at her. At this woman who had thought 3 moves ahead of every catastrophe, who had never once asked to be rescued, who had said 3 words on a dark porch in October that had cost her more than any fence she had ever repaired. "I don't have land to bring you," he said. "No property, nothing guaranteed except that I know how to work, and I know how to read this land now because you taught me." "I did not ask what you have," she said. "I asked if you would stay." The snow on the windowsill was 3 inches deep. "Yes," he said. The following morning, before the ruling arrived, Jessie was at the kitchen table when Clara came downstairs. He had a letter in his hands, open, reading it with the expression of someone who has just been told something that changes the shape of something they thought they knew. He had written to the Pinkerton Agency Records Office 2 weeks earlier. He had asked for the complete record of the Rose Alderman case. The reply had come on the morning stage from Cheyenne. Rose Alderman had been released from the county jail after 91 days, when the actual perpetrators of the robbery were identified, and the original filing was formally withdrawn. She was alive. She was living in Laramie. She had a daughter. Clara came downstairs and found him there. She read his face the way she read land, the way she had been learning to read it for 8 weeks. He showed her the letter without explanation. She read it, looked up at him. "She is alive," he said. His voice was different, not relieved exactly. The voice of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that the absence of it is disorienting. "You have been living with this for 6 years," Clara said, "and she has been alive in Laramie for 6 years." "I never checked." "Why?" "Because if she was dead, I needed to know I had let her die. And if she was alive, I needed to know that I had chosen to be the kind of man who could do what I did. I was not sure which of those was worse to find out." Clara looked at the letter, then at him. "What will you do with this?" "Write to her, not to ask for anything. Just to tell her that I know what I did was wrong, and to ask if she's all right." "That is the right thing." "I know." He had chosen to stay before this letter arrived. He had said yes in the kitchen with the snow on the windowsills when he still believed he was the man who had let Rose die. The letter did not create his worthiness. It confirmed what had been quietly true for 8 weeks, demonstrated in early mornings and repaired fences, and a blanket laid over a sleeping woman in a blizzard. The ruling came by messenger that afternoon. Clara read it at the kitchen table. twice. Then she set it down and pressed both palms flat on the wood and breathed. "It stands," she said. "The water source stands as Morrison property. The deed of transfer is limited to the original ranch structures and grazing land." Jessie waited. "He still has the debt," she said. "I know. But now I have leverage." "I know." She looked at him. He was almost smiling. She was, too. The morning after the ruling, Clara rode to town alone. She went to the Red Bluff Savings and Loan and asked to see Hector Voss. She did not bring Jessie, she did not bring Whitfield. She brought the ruling, a written proposal, and herself. She would sell him the water access rights, not the land, not the source. The access rights, the legal right to run infrastructure through the northwest corner and draw from the source for commercial irrigation purposes. In exchange, enough money to cover the full debt and leave sufficient capital to restock and run the ranch through 3 productive years. He got the water. She got clear title to everything else. Hector read the proposal. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is not what I intended this to look like." "I know what you intended," Clara said evenly. "This is what it looks like now." He signed, not with his usual warmth, not with the pleasant expression that had served him so well for so many years. He signed with the face of a man who has run a careful calculation and arrived at an answer he does not prefer but cannot improve. When Clara walked out of the bank onto Main Street, May Dunbar was sitting in her wagon across the way, in town for supplies, and she saw Clara come through the bank door. She looked at Clara's face. Then she allowed herself a small and genuine smile, the particular expression of a woman who has known someone long enough to recognize the exact moment their story changes direction. May climbed down from the wagon and walked over. "Your mother would have been pleased," she said. "She would have told me to do this 3 months ago," Clara said. "Your mother also married your father in a blizzard with nobody's blessing but her own. She would have understood the 3 months." They stood together on Main Street in the November cold and said nothing more, because nothing more needed to be said. 3 weeks after the civil settlement, the district attorney's office in Cheyenne filed charges against Hector Voss. Whitfield had submitted documentation on his own initiative as an officer of the court regarding the deed of transfer and the specific question of whether Thomas's signature had been obtained under circumstances constituting fraud. The case went to the district court. Hector was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in the county penitentiary at Laramie. He received the sentence without his usual expression. For the first time in 30 years of managing appearances, he had nothing left to manage. Clara heard the verdict by telegram. She was standing at the post office counter. She read it, stood with the paper in her hand for a moment, then folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and walked outside. Jessie was with the horses. 2 years in the county penitentiary, she said. He waited. "It is not about whether that is enough," she said. "It is about it being real, official, written down somewhere that says it happened and it was wrong." She looked at the telegram folded in her hand. "That is what I needed." She put it in her pocket. She didn't take it out again. That evening she found Jessie in the barn working by lantern light. He was mending the bridle, the same bridle he had been working on the night of the blizzard. The physical echo was not lost on her. She came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. Set one on the post beside him. Stood there. "I need someone who knows cattle country," she said, "when I start buying additional grazing land in the spring. I know some. And someone who does not object to being taught things. I have been taught things for 2 months and have not objected yet. And someone," she said, "who reads a room the way I read land. Who knows what is there before anyone names it." He set the bridle down, stood up, looked at her in the lantern light. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the post beside the coffee cup. The Pinkerton badge, both broken halves, side by side. He had carried them for 6 years. He was putting them down now, not throwing them away, setting them down deliberately in a place where they could be seen. "I will need to do something with those," he said. Not throw them away, just not carry them. I know a woman who keeps letters in a wooden box, Clara said. Some things you keep without wearing them. He looked at her. I want to build something here with you. Not because I have nowhere else to be. Because there is nowhere else I want to go. Then stay, she said. And we will build it. She held out her right hand, bare, without the gloves for the first time in weeks, in a gesture that meant something other than work. He took it. They were married in the Red Bluff Church on a Saturday in December, in the building where Clara's father had preached for 20 years, conducted by the new minister from Ohio, who didn't carry the weight of the old history into the ceremony with him. May stood in the front pew with apple bread for afterward, and cried once, briefly, and afterward pretended she hadn't. Nobody mentioned it. Danny sat 3 rows back in his good shirt, which was slightly too large for him, watching with the expression of someone trying to memorize something they would want to be able to describe later. The following April, the Wyoming spring arrived the way it always does at that elevation. Sudden, muddy, more welcome for having been waited for so long. The ranch sign at the east gate read, Cane Ranch, in letters Jessie had carved from pine over the winter. Below it, smaller in Clara's handwriting painted in black, it read, Established 1884, Morrison Land, Cane Hands. Clara went to the northwest corner in the early morning, the way she always did when she needed to think. The soil was soft from snowmelt. The grass was coming back. The water infrastructure stakes were already in the ground, marking where the pipes would go in the coming weeks. Jessie came up beside her. They stood looking at the stakes without talking. My father said he built every room bigger than he needed, Clara said, because he wanted whoever came after him to have room to grow. He was right about the land, Jessie said. He was right about most things. She looked at the churned earth, the stakes, the whole northwest corner that looked like the beginning of something. I want to do the same. Whatever we build here, rooms bigger than we need. Starting in September, Jessie said. She looked at him. How did you know? I have been paying attention for 7 months, he said. I notice things. She laughed. Quick, genuine, slightly surprised, the way people laugh when they have been seen precisely. She took his hand. They stood in the April morning on land that was still becoming what it was going to be. Danny was working near the water stakes, moving a surveyor's marker at Jessie's instruction. He set the stake and straightened up and looked at the sign above the east gate. Cane Ranch, and below it the line in Clara's handwriting. 2 names joined together. He stood there a moment looking at them. He had no name to join to anything. No family name that anyone had written down anywhere. He was 16 years old, and this ranch was the closest thing to a home he had known in 4 years. Clara saw him looking at the sign. She looked at Jessie. Jessie looked at Danny. Nobody said anything. The moment passed. Danny went back to work. It didn't resolve. It wasn't meant to. The world doesn't resolve every story just because the main story has found its ending. Danny would be all right. It would be all... The reader knew this because they had watched him across 10 months of hard work and genuine care, and the particular resilience of someone who has learned to keep going because stopping is not an option. But all right was not the same as complete. And the happiness of Clara and Jessie was more real, not less, because of the story still unwritten beside theirs. At the end of the working day, the light went low over the Wyoming ridge in the orange gold that belongs to that part of the world in that season, the color that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Clara reached into her coat pocket for her work gloves to put on for the evening feeding. Jessie was a few feet away, his back to her, looking at the survey stakes. He reached back without turning around and held out her second glove. She had only pulled out one. She hadn't asked. He just knew. She pulled on both gloves. stood for a moment looking at the ridge, at the land that was still becoming what it was going to be, at the sky burning above the ridge long after the sun itself had gone below it. She thought briefly of the morning 8 months ago, standing in front of the barn in the fog at 5 in the morning with a paper stamped in red ink, her hands shaking on the third reading. Her hands didn't shake now. She walked toward the barn. He walked beside her. She had asked him once, on a dark porch in October, not to walk away. She understood now that she had not been asking about that one night or that one man. She had been asking the question she had stopped knowing how to ask: whether there was something worth staying for, whether the staying itself was possible. The answer had turned out to be the land under her feet, and the man beside her, and the work that waited every morning before the sun was fully up, and the rooms they would build bigger than they needed, and the spring that came every year to the Wyoming grassland, whether you were ready for it or not. It had turned out to be enough. It had turned out to be everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.